Okay, I can see we're right on 4 o'clock. I can still see people joining in with us too. So we'll get started and we'll maybe start with our territorial acknowledgement. So greetings, everyone. Welcome this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We will be recording the session, so if you don't want to appear in the recording, please feel free to take this time to shut off your camera and mute your microphone. We want to start with this slide because this is about searching for relationships and exchanging knowledge with counterparts. And I like this quote here from McGee and Henry. I heard him say this and I jotted it down once. He said, "You know how doors are open? We can open them wider if we just have conversations." So I'm hoping this is the beginning of a great conversation between secondary and elementary panels and the chance to start building some relationships across panels. So I'll just start with the territorial acknowledgement. In Waterloo Region, we acknowledge that the territory on which our schools and facilities are situated are the land traditionally and currently used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and neutral peoples. It is with deep gratitude and respect that we are honored to be able to care for it and educate students on their traditional lands. And I will pass it over to Rhonda to do a quick introduction.
Hello, welcome everybody. We are so happy that on this beautiful sunshiny day out there, you decided to come stare at your computer screen that we can be on for you. So just as Andrew said, this is super exciting. It is an opportunity that we hope to have many more opportunities in the near future where elementary and secondary are coming together in the best interest of student learning. And Andrea, if you can just go on to the next slide, I do just want to take a second to introduce to you today. This is our central Destreaming team who are working super hard at preparing our secondary schools and teachers for this movement that is happening. It consists of secondary teachers as well as some secondary consultants. And today we have with us Andrew Han, who you've already heard from, and Lisa Hicknell and Jill Waters, and they will be navigating this session. This session has also occurred for secondary math teachers as part of a series of voluntary PD that secondary math teachers are engaging in at the moment. And on that note, I think I'm passing it back over to Jill.
All right, so I am mostly the slide master and chat in charge of the chat today, but I am going to start us off with our learning goals today. So we have 3 learning goals, and these learning goals, they directly connect with the ministry goals, and they directly connect with the work we've been doing with secondary educators. Our first goal is to understand the ways that Destreaming can be used to create equitable outcomes. Our second goal is to understand the role of streaming in systemic oppression. And finally, it's to identify the cultural shifts necessary to dismantle systemic discrimination and structural inequities. So when we look at these goals, it really tells us that this work is not just about, educating in math, but looking at how we can make our system a more equitable place for all of our students. And with that, it's Andrew.
So one thing I want to do at the onset of this presentation is remind everyone that this work of Destreaming is deeply rooted in equity. And this is a strong reminder for me that I've experienced a great deal of privilege as a white cisgender male in our education system. And while I work hard to research and read and understand, I do not have the same lived experiences as all the people I serve. So if I say anything today that's out of line with your lived experience, to please let us know as presenters. And over to Lisa.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to get us started with some session norms for today, recognizing that at the best of times, participating in a session like this from 4 till 5 on a work day can be a challenge, but then recognizing the added layers of remote learning, families at home around us, technology. So if everyone can just do their best with these, that's all that we ask for you to be fully present with us today, to be more curious than certain, to share freely but hold lightly, to choose to engage and take risks, to celebrate the process in all its glory, and to be exploratory, not confirmatory. On the next slide, We're just going to review some of the work that's grounded us in this de-streaming work. In the WRDSB, the conditions for learning represent 3 areas where educators make decisions related to pedagogy and assessment, relationships, and the learning environment, with the intention of meeting outcomes related to student achievement, well-being, equity and inclusion, and the global competencies. Based on our own experiences as students, the things we were taught at our faculties of education, and based on what was modeled for us by mentor teachers and colleagues as we established our identities as educators, on the secondary side, at least, we were led to believe that different conditions best serve students in applied and academic courses. But after viewing these practices and their outcomes through a human rights and equity lens, we now recognize that despite our best intentions to meet the needs of these students, the impact has not been what we may have intended. In order to help reframe our thinking away from some of the areas that our early experiences may have rooted firmly within us, our secondary stakeholders have adopted a series of belief statements to ground us as we enter into this work. As you listen to them today, please think about which statements resonate with you. And if you find yourself pushing back against one or two, lean into them and think about why that might be the case. So they are as follows. Each and every student is competent, capable, and curious. All students deserve access to high-level, equitable, and inclusive instructional practices. Every student has the right to pursue whatever post-secondary pathway they aspire to. Students drive the conditions for learning based on their diverse learning needs and lived experiences. And the educator is foundational in creating an inclusive and anti-oppressive environment in which all students will thrive. And I am passing it back over to Andrew now, I believe.
And that's a great segue into our first activity here. We want to get the group here thinking right away. So we ask you to join us on the Jamboard. It's going to be dropped in the chat. And we'd like you to think about, to what extent is math objective? And so on the Jamboard, there's a rating scale. We'd encourage you to put an anonymous sticky note anywhere you think that fits on that Jamboard scale. So please take a few moments to add your sticky note there, and then we'll use that to kind of frame our conversation as we move forward. Now, as you're placing your sticky notes on there, know that you can move them around. So part of a continuum dialogue is an opportunity to revisit your thinking as the session goes on, and then again at the end of the session. And this is a great math task that you can do with your math classes as well. You can put out statements about mathematical properties and see if students believe they are always true or never true or somewhere in the middle, and see how they're changing, see how their thinking changes over the course of a lesson. So we're seeing sticky notes, a lot of them kind of skewing to the left there, but there's some interesting sort of placement there. And again, we encourage you to revisit that as we move through the session.
Jill, you're up.
I don't know if we lost Jill or maybe we lost the connection, but I can speak on this slide. So I'll go ahead. Streaming has existed in Ontario for over a century, actually since Confederation. It's evolved and changed, but it's continually fell along race and class lines and has continued to be perpetuated by this kind of false sort of pedagogical narrative that allowing students to be grouped into ability groups leads to better learning outcomes. And so what has allowed it to perpetuate is that streaming serves some, but not all. And so that leads us into sort of our new course description. And this new course description comes to us from the Ministry of Education. It gives you a good idea of the types of topics that are going to be covered in the new ministry course. It's fairly large, so it's a lot to digest there. So I'm going to give everybody a minute just to sit with the course description there and the course code, and then we'll talk a little bit afterwards about what you're seeing. And if you have insights, feel free to maybe drop them in the chat. If you're seeing connections to grade 8 or other things, please feel free. Any insights, anything that you're noticing, feel free to add to the chat there. So a couple of reminders, this is a brand new course. This hasn't existed before. It will be one course code for all grade 9 students. So all incoming grade 9 students will take this, with the exception of some students who will continue to take fast forward or locally developed courses. So no longer will students be sorted into applied and academic. And again, we talked about the very important reason for that. It's an important junction in a student's academic career. And so to put them into a streamed or stratified system sends a very dangerous message about their academic achievement potential. And so with that, we're going to move on to our next slide here. I hinted at this at the beginning, but the data we've been gathering locally as well as provincially shows that students who have historically been marginalized by our education system are consistently and disproportionately being enrolled in the applied stream. And this impact of sort of being counseled out instead of welcomed in at that grade 9 year is an important junction in students' intellectual development and having implications on grad rates and other forms of achievement pathways. We know that for students during these years, their identity is very much so in flux. It's being informed by the environment around them, and it's changing day to day. So to put students again into that stratified system at this point in their academic career sends a clear and dangerous message. And while the applied system was modeled as a hands-on approach to a college pathway, however, time has told us a very different story. The other important part here is kind of seeing this as a policy issue. So people have long been trained to see the deficiencies of people rather than policy, and it's pretty easy to make that mistake. People are in our faces while policies are distant, and we are particularly poor at seeing the policies lurking behind the struggles of the people in front of us. And that quote is from Dr. Ibrahim X. Kendi. And there's a link here that we can drop in the chat that talks a little bit about mathematics for reconciliation and being able to see the problems within the existing math paradigm. And now I pass it over to Jill, and we're going to do another little activity around a data talk.
All right, sorry about before. I had no sound at all, so I couldn't even hear you folks talking. So you'll notice up on this screen here that we have 2 circles, and we notice that we have the information of the words applied, academic, cohort, 2014, 2015, WRDSB. So in the chat, I'm hoping we can have a bit of a chat waterfall. If you can put what you notice and what you wonder. So I'll give you a moment just to populate our chat. Yes, and as Andrew put, it's been purposefully abstracted. So what do you notice and what do you wonder as you look at these 2 things? All right, Caitlin wonders, I wonder what the 2 colors represent. All right, excellent. Thank you, Caitlin. All right, why are we using data from 2014, 2015? Good question. Hebron is noticing the blue is larger in academic than applied. Chad's wondering what the orange means. Scott was noticing large blue in academic. Then we have, does the blue represent grad rates and graduation rates? I noticed the 2 look very different. All right. Orange is bigger in applied than academic. All right. So these are some really great observations and questions. I'm going to go to the next slide, and the next slide is going to provide us with just a wee bit more information. So when we look at this wee bit more information, what we can see here is that we can see that this connects to the 4-year graduation by grade 9 math course type. So when we add that bit of information, what do we notice? What do we wonder? Let's take a moment and see. So we have, why does math have such an impact? Would English look similar? I wonder what barriers to success is for students in the applied stream. Why does the disparity exist? All right. Any other wonderings or observations? Oh, how can we help grade 9 students to change this? All right. Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. What would the 5-year graduation rate look like? Well, I can tell you that the 5-year graduation rate, what's interesting is that 5-year graduation rate, while there is an increase in graduates, the gap between the applied and academic still is maintained, that we still have more successful students in the academic stream than the applied stream. I'm going to add another layer of data here. All right, so I've added another layer of data. And when I add this other layer of data, we can see a couple of things. But before I talk about that, I'm hoping you can add any observations that you have to our chat waterfall there. So there's a question too, is there a difference if we look at more recent data? So when we look at those numbers, right, that's the cohort. So that's the year they entered school. So that would be fairly recent data there. Pre-pandemic. Why does the applied show less success? That is a great question. Something to think about is that the applied level programming was meant to improve outcomes for our applied level students. It was meant to be a more hands-on pathway to lead directly to college. And unfortunately, what has happened is that's not been the case. Okay, and then we have, I believe, back to Andrew.
Yeah, and I saw some great questions there in the chat that kept coming up, and the part that gets me wondering is I wonder if those students maybe had access to peers who were in the academic stream, and how that would change the dynamics of their classroom as well. Remember that prior to grade 9, students maybe haven't experienced that formal streaming process. So there's something about that that maybe disrupts the flow of their academic learning. We also see that when we look at the provincial standard and students achieving it in our most recent data, that the applied level group is also continuing to struggle with that. So again, there's something about the applied level programming that's maybe not meeting the needs of those students, and that's what kind of requires us to make a shift. We'll go on to our next set of data. So locally, we haven't been completing census data. I think that in itself kind of tells a story about what we valued in the past versus what we value going forward. In school boards where they do collect census data, what we are seeing is that there are disparities along racial lines, and that this is a systemic racial injustice. We also see in sort of locally that the applied and academic enrollment falls along socioeconomic lines as well. And so there's sort of those kind of problematic pieces. We also see it falls along lines of adults with one university degree in their home. So we see these sort of problematic patterns being perpetuated year over year within our system. And then there's also data that we just don't have access to now locally. But I think it would be naive of us to think that we would be any different than other urban centers around the province. So York, Toronto, Ottawa, Carleton just came out with their data, and they're all seeing similar patterns to each other. So this is data collected by the York University study towards race equity in education. So we are just getting ready to do some breakout rooms. we want to kind of prompt you with these questions. So what data caught you most off guard? What did not sit well with you? What changes can we make? And in the breakout rooms, we are going to go for about 5 minutes. So I'm going to set a 5-minute timer on here. So that'll remind you that we need to come back to the main room in about 5 minutes. And that'll give you a chance to discuss with your group these 3 sort of prompts in kind of like a speed dating rotation. And we're going to set groups of, let's say, 4, and I will open up those rooms now, and we'll see you back in about 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Just as everybody's rejoined us, we'll maybe throw it out to the group. Was there anything in particular that came up in your chat that you'd like to share with the rest of the group? Any prompting questions or insights that people found they'd like to share with the rest of us? Okay, I think we have just about everybody back now, and we'll move on to our next slide then. So we do have another little activity we'd like to engage everybody in. So we are going to use a Padlet, and we'll drop the link for the Padlet in the chat in a moment. What we'd like you to do is follow this sentence structure with us. So we want you to think about your own experiences in school, whether it is as a student, teacher, an educational leader, or things that you've heard, seen, or experienced. And we want you to write in the sentence structure, I think, and then you can fill it in with racism, sexism, classism, heteronormism, heterosexism, homophobia, ableism, elitism, or any other ism is happening when I hear, see, or feel. So we'd like you to put a sticky note on our Padlet with an experience that you've seen, heard, or felt. And then what we'll do, what you'll see happening is there will be sort of a reorganization of the sticky notes happening. Please don't be alarmed. We're doing it on purpose, and it will help us for debriefing our activity here. So we'd invite everybody now to join the Padlet, and we're gonna spend maybe 5 minutes, kind of go dark time. We'll be quiet here and just allow everybody to think and populate this. And feel free to put as many sticky notes as you'd like. The more we have there, the better, and that'll help us with our debriefing. So we'll do 5 minutes of just kind of quiet reflection and adding to the Padlet.
Could you go back to the slides with the prompts? Is that possible?
Yep, we could put that back up. Thanks, Jill. And be honest, you got me working overtime here. We've never had this many sticky notes before, and I'm trying to capture them all and get them into the right groups. This is amazing. Thank you everybody for this thinking. And I apologize if I miss anybody's sticky notes because they're way down on the page here. Because there's so many of them. This is awesome, and I'm trying to pull them up and get them organized. So bear with me. So maybe we'll take our last few sticky notes here as we get ready to kind of debrief. And I'm just going to do a little more reorganization here. Um, Okay, I think I got just about all of them. So we'll maybe head back into the slide deck to talk a little bit about what we're seeing here and how I've kind of organized the sticky notes here. So what I've done is I've taken our sticky notes and I've tried to arrange them into 3 corners. And as I kind of speak on this, Jill's going to scroll through and we're going to debrief what the 3 corners are. So if you're not familiar with this notion of what's called the power triangle. It is a paradigm for thinking about oppression, and so it's actually made of 3 corners. There's the teacher talk and belief systems, or individual prejudices. There's the individual acts, and I might have got my 2 corners kind of mixed up here. And then there's the 3rd corner of the power triangle, which is the institutional systems. And so I think as a school board, what we've done very well is we've talked a lot about the individual acts, how teachers can intervene when they see these individual acts. We've focused a lot on the individual belief systems. We've talked a lot about microaggressions. And so what we haven't focused a lot on is that final corner. And if we just scroll through one last animation here, this is the corner we need to focus on in terms of the triangle now, because the 3 corners help sort of perpetuate the cycle. So just disrupting one corner does not sort of disrupt the cycle of oppression. What we have to do is we have to focus on all 3 corners continually and over again in order to disrupt these cycles of oppression. So now we're turning our focus, and if we just go one more animation here, on these institutional systems. And Destreaming is just one element of sort of tackling that institutional oppression that exists within our education system. So we'll go one more slide down and we can see this image a little more clearly. Again, the 3 corners reinforce themselves. And if you'd like to read more about the power triangle, there's a great article that's linked here, and we'll drop it in the chat from Oise that discusses how to disrupt these systems and why it's important to disrupt all 3 corners simultaneously. And we'll just go to the next slide, and I'll reiterate this quote that I said earlier. So streaming gave this kind of illusion of choice. However, it is oppressive and serves historically privileged groups. It is the ultimate. It's ultimately the opposite of cultivating math identities for our students. It sends a clear message to some students that they are math thinkers and others that they are not. And so what I will do now is share a quick video here, or I'll have Jill share this video for us. What we have here is Professor John Hattie. He's looked at the empirical data kind of worldwide on what he's going to refer to as tracking, what we would refer to as streaming. Okay, and so he takes this empirical lens towards systemic issues in education, and in this case, he's applying it to streaming and tracking. And basically, he's saying that wherever streaming happens, it typically gets used to continue to further marginalize groups. And so when you say in your applied class, for instance, that you're putting students into an ability group at such an early junction to help them, in fact, what you're doing is actually harming them. So if I'll let Jill play it. It's about 5 minutes in length, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about what we hear.
Well, tracking actually doesn't have a negative effect size. It has a very close to 0 effect size. And in many ways, that means it doesn't matter whether you track or you don't track, because that's what a 0 means when you compare tracking to non-tracking. The problem with tracking is 2 things. Firstly is the expectations it sets for kids. It says to them very clearly that this is where you perform. And certainly in some subjects, and probably mathematics is the best example, quite often what the teachers then do is they only teach material that's relative to that tracking. So even if you develop and become better at doing mathematics, and you may have the ability to go into a higher track, you can't, because you haven't done the right amount of subjects, you haven't done the right content area. But the biggest problem with tracking by a million miles is the equity issue. For instance, if you look in this country here, there is a high probability of African American and Hispanics being in the lower track groups. How can you possibly defend that apartheid in our schools? How can you possibly argue that kids are destined in terms of how they're going to succeed in life, depending on the colour of their skin? That's so indefensible. And so when you take that equity issue into account, and then you take on the other hand, the effect size is close to zero, then I think it's incumbent upon us to find ways where we can reduce those inequity problems. And stopping ability grouping is one of the issues. Now we have to be careful here. There is a detracking movement. There is a group trying to detrack, and it's not showing much effect either. And that I think is partly because we then don't come back to attend what really matters, and that is for each individual kid, what is the impact we're having on them? And so that's what I want to come back to. It's about that impact. And one of the problems of the tracking and the ability grouping is it does set expectations which may not be appropriate for many of the students. I am not a fan of tracking because it becomes, people think it's actually solving an educational problem. It's not. It's making the teacher's life easier. And there's nothing wrong with making teachers' life easier. But those teachers who are in a detrack situation, who do have high expectations for all their kids, not only can that be more successful, you don't get the equity problems that you do with tracking. So it's not a straightforward answer. It's not a straightforward problem. But I do think there are some serious problems with the tracking that really make it very hard to defend.
I like the part that he mentions there about attending to what really matters. So in Destreaming, we've taken the labels off of students as they enter their grade 9 year in terms of mathematics. We give them one course code to be enrolled into. But research after research that we found says that in order for this to be successful, we also have to work on the human-facing facets of Destreaming. And that's the instructional moves, the complex math instruction that's necessary for students to be successful. So research after research, for instance, Carol Burris from New York City, or if you look at Joe Bowler out in California, they've done this sort of Destreaming movement in their local communities. And what they found is that it needs to be a two-pronged approach. There's the systemic disruption of removing the labels, removing the tracks, but then you have to do very intense work with teachers around pedagogy, assessment, and instruction, and wraparound supports for those students in order for the Destreaming movement to be successful. Now, this leads us with a question I think that maybe hasn't been answered yet, which is why math? I think we would all agree that mathematical thinking is constructivist by nature, so it lends itself well to this work. We know that math is important for the workplace of the present, and we also know that it will be important for the workplace of the future. So 70% of future work will require some form of post-secondary education, and we know that success in post-secondary education is oftentimes tied to mathematics. We know that this will be tied to the workplace of the future. Workplaces of the future will be tied also inherently to possible STEM careers. Applied level mathematical programming just was not properly preparing students for the college experience. So when they followed students who took the applied level path through into college in college programs that required mathematic understanding and courses, those students typically struggled and their credits became at risk. When similar students went through the academic and university path and then arrived in college, they typically performed very well. And then high-level problem solving, I think we can all agree, being able to understand data and be critical of data is necessary for all of our citizens in the future. One of the interesting things that came out of some early pilots from Limestone, where they looked at students who chose academic math, despite maybe their poor performance on the grade 6 EQAO, they were far more likely to succeed than similar students who then enrolled in the applied math credit. And so those early pilot projects focused on math because that's where the biggest disparity was in applied and academic enrollment. And that's where people wanted to start making those corrections. And then as they began to investigate it, some of this information started to reveal itself, like that early EQO indicator and how that kind of corrects with that choice in math course. So the biggest indicator of success, as we see kind of across the board, is that choice of grade 9 math course. So that's an important thing when we're connecting these dots for why math and why math first. So I'm going to pass it over to Rhonda to talk a little bit about what we're doing.
Man, right as I took a drink. So we would be very naive to think that this is a concern that starts in grade 9. This is a K-12 movement that we need to be paying attention to in all grades. And there are things in elementary that happen with the best intent that have a significant impact on that student's future in education. So we would like to collect, there's some really brilliant voices in the room right now. And we would like to collect, like, what is the work that needs to be done in elementary to help support this movement as a K-12 initiative. So we're going to give you a chance to go off into some small groups to kind of discuss what role does elementary play in this, what structures are in place that are sort of supporting a streaming movement, and then what barriers do we need to eliminate so that we can eliminate informal streaming in elementary. And then we want to bring everybody back together and hear what was shared in your groups so that we can start to collect some of this, which will help guide our work over the next year in elementary. So we're going to put you back into the breakout rooms, let's say until about 10:02, so about 7 minutes, whoever's got those breakout rooms happening. And then we will be prepared to come back and share with everybody because we want to hear your voice.
Welcome back, everyone.
We need to book like another hour where we could just discuss that. Go into a breakout room and discuss. We were just in the heat of it, and then that stupid little thing came up and said you have to come back now. So I'm hoping other breakout rooms were having similar discussions around this, and I'd like to open it up now to hear what some of those discussions were about. Feel free to put it in the chat, but even preferably unmic and share with the group what some of the thinking was from this, because this is our collective work that we need to own.
I put my hand
Hi, Rhonda.
up to be polite. Sorry, Dawn, you can go ahead if you want to.
Okay. Our group, well, we came down with a couple of things, mainly is that one, the modified IEP is a major barrier because kids are modified and then all of a sudden they go to grade 9 and they're out of phase. And so they're already starting in a hole, trying to get out. And two, that there are no intensive support systems in primary and early junior to support them, to bring them up to grade level like there is for literacy. So those are kind of our structures that encourage streaming because, well, if they can't really do grade 8 math, then we need to put them in applied, and that there's no support mechanism in place to bring them up to grade level early enough that they can be successful before they get to grade 7 and 8.
Excellent points. Danielle?
Yeah, we also talked about the modified IEP and how that can be a barrier. And often in grade 7, when we get students from grade 6, we automatically are thinking like, what are the modifications on your IEP? And we're looking to high school because that's our transition. And it's interesting how sometimes we adjust IEPs to, a higher grade or a lower grade based on based on our diagnostic assessments where we see them heading to high school. So the modified IEP can definitely be a barrier, but the outrageously obvious streaming that exists in elementary for sure is French immersion. So wondering how many French immersion students are actually in that applied little circular chart that you have there, as opposed to how many, and then obviously how many are did not graduate versus graduate, but the disparity between these French immersion students are probably going to be in the academic graph that you had posted. That'd be my guess based on what we see at our school. So
thank you, Danielle. I can only see a few of you. So if I notice, Steve, you have your hand up, so please go. And if somebody else has their hand up, and Jill or Andrew, if somebody else can see that, let me know.
Thanks, Rhonda. For those that were in our little breakout group there a couple minutes ago, I was saying this, and that is, it's interesting when we have primary students that are put on modified IEPs, and that would essentially be because we've done some assessment that has put us in that position to say, okay, this student to be successful needs to be on a modified or accommodated IEP. The other part to that is if we don't do that, the grade that goes home on the report card and the assessment that we land on is low. It's a low grade. Nobody likes that. Nobody likes to send home a low grade to a parent on a report card. But before we do that, we ask ourselves, okay, what's the work that we need to do to support this student? And quite often, and even at the elementary and primary level, the work that we jump to right away is, oh, let's modify the program and that will help support the student. When in fact, I wonder, and I'm guilty of this as well, when in fact I wonder that early in a child's schooling career, when they're achieving a low grade, should the question be, let's not modify the program. Folks, we have a lot of hard work to do to get this student up to grade level at this early age so that they can, continue on a trajectory of grade level appropriate work. I think as soon as we jump to an IEP and we identify students like that, certainly at a young age like that, it's hard to get out of. And again, we as educators, in good conscience, we do the right thing, but is that really the right hard work that we need to do? I'll stop there.
I totally agree, Steve. And I think another piece of that is educating parents on that, right? Because parents like to see that pretty mark on their child's report card as well. And talking to some parents as they go up further throughout the education system in grade 8, in grade 9, they've kind of lost sight that there was an IEP and that their child was actually on a completely different program. Like somewhere along the line, they've sort of forgot that was happening. And
right.
I think that's a really big piece too, to let, like somebody in my breakout room was saying, the parent comes and the parent's like actually advocating, I want my child on a modified IEP. And I think if we took that moment to explain to the parent, like, listen, when your child hits grade 9, like that's going to be a brick wall running at full speed. This probably isn't a great idea. Like you need to see how that's going to be limiting the options further down the road, where we kind of have a tunnel vision of just focusing on where we are right now.
I said I was done, Rhonda, but now I'm not, because now you got me going. But I swear, I'll just say this one last part. When we create the IEP, when we do all that good work and we identify the strengths, needs, and all that great stuff, and we modify the program, accommodate whatever we're doing, and you're right, Rhonda, sometimes the parents say, oh, good, this is much better. Now we have fixed the problem. You know what? I'm not sure we have. We really haven't fixed the problem. The student is still not achieving where we want them to achieve. So let's put the IEP aside. Let's do the hard work that we need to do to get the student there. Regan White, I saw you chimed in with a comment as well. And Regan and I have, I think, quite a few years ago, have had conversations around grades versus anecdotal feedback. So let's get rid of the grades. Don't worry about what grade comes home on the report card that makes a grade 2 educational team parents say, oh, this student needs to be modified. You know what? Let's identify where we need to close the gaps and start working on it. Put the IEP aside. You don't even need it. Did I say that out loud?
And it was recorded.
Oh dear. Hey folks, it was nice working with you.
CLM, Sherlock.
Andrew, I think, did I see your hand up, or are you getting us to move on?
Maybe a little bit of both. I want to say I agree with Steve's thinking there. Steve, I don't know if you remember, but I volunteered in your grade 8 class like 15 years ago, and you showed me the ropes of being a teacher. So, and I was new, I was green. I think you had me running a lot of photocopies just to get a handle on the photocopier. But anyways, you make great points. These are not student problems. These are adult problems. Like, it's the adult's job to address it, and we can't take the easy way out all the time. Or take the way that maybe is the least resistance. Like, sometimes you got to dig deep and really work with students and maybe change pedagogy. And the reason my hand was up, I'll use this to kind of segue us to our group had talked about what does the pedagogy look like in grade 9, and I realized we didn't even include that in the presentation. It could be a whole other presentation. We're running through a series of toolkits, and this will maybe help me segue to the end here, around Peter Lilliedale's Thinking Classroom. I'm going to hold the book up. maybe everybody can see it there. It's a pedagogical approach. Peter Lilliedale took an empirical lens at teacher moves and saw which ones were high yield and which ones weren't. He advocates for visibly random groups and vertical non-permanent surfaces, making sure no students are anonymous, but every student is comfortable, and reducing social anxiety and crowdsourcing information in your math classroom. So that is the book that we're subscribing to, amongst others, that we are putting in the hands of our early secondary educators to try to help sort of shift practice to meet the needs of incoming grade 8s who might be in a variety of different places, and to make that grade 9 course a place that cultivates math identity. So that kind of helps me get to my last point here, because we're at 5 o'clock. I know everybody's got to go have some dinner. To what extent is math objective? We'd invite you to revisit the Jamboard there and see if maybe you've changed your perspective on this. And it's okay if you haven't. You don't have to move your sticky note. This is just kind of a move, again, that you can use in your math classroom. So you can use this to examine any math property, and put the two ends on the continuum and have students evaluate at the beginning of the lesson and the end of the lesson. With that, I'm going to move on to a thank you. So thank you so much for your time. As I started the session, I'd mentioned this idea of starting conversations and building bridges, and I think this is an important bridge that we need to build. And hopefully this is the first of many sessions where we get a chance to talk with elementary counterparts about what we're doing in secondary. And so I'll pass it over to Rhonda. Maybe Rhonda, you have something you want to say at the end here?
I'm all good. I just really appreciate everybody coming out to hear this. It has been recorded. I will put it out on the elementary math Google group. So please share it with any other educators. This isn't just for intermediate. As we've said, it's a K-12 initiative. We want to educate parents on what's happening in the Destreaming, and we know that elementary teachers are a good source for parents to come to. So let's make sure we're all on the same page with this and have the same messages. And on that, now get away from your screen and go out and enjoy the beautiful sunshine. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Who's recording?
Jill's on recording.